A few weeks ago, my mom got a phone call that I thought was going to change our lives for the better. Now I think that call might have put us in terrible danger. I want to document what I've been experiencing in case something happens to us. The day had started like almost every day since the accident. Our dog Max had jumped onto my bed while it was still dark out, needing a walk and a fresh bowl of food. Before I left to take him around the block, I checked in on my mom. Her room was dark, her breathing even. She was sleeping soundly. She was still asleep when I returned. She slept while I cooked breakfast, while I did the dishes, while I showered and got ready for school, while I packed a lunch for myself and for her, which I leave in the fridge for later. I was shoving clothes into a woven laundry bag to drag to the basement machines when I got home from school later, when I heard her scream. "Mom?" I ran to her room, Max on my heels, and pushed open the door to find her sitting up in bed, arms wrapped around her legs, her head resting on her knees, sobbing. "He was here," she said between hiccuped breaths. She didn't say who, but she didn't have to. I knew who he was. My dad, Ben. The thing is, he couldn't have been here. A year ago, he'd been driving Mom and my little brother Davy into the city when he'd hit a patch of ice and they'd skidded off the road and into a freezing river. Mom had been the only one to make it out of the car, but she hadn't really. Mentally, she was still stuck there, frozen under the ice, trapped in her grief. I wasn't doing much better. Sometimes I could barely drag myself out of bed. Sometimes I swear I could hear my dad calling me from the other room, or Davy giggling as he played with Max. But someone had to take care of us, so I'd taken over doing most everything around the house because if I didn't, nobody would. Mom just couldn't, not yet. I'd been clinging to a tiny sliver of hope that she was starting to come back. She hadn't had a nightmare in 3 days, but now? "Emma, I saw him, and he was..." She looked up at me, her eyes red-rimmed and brimming with tears. "He opened his mouth and water spilled out." She buried her head again, and I sank down onto the bed next to her, stroking her hair. "It's okay, Mom. You're safe." I repeated it over and over, the words like a chant, until I felt her shoulders sag and her breathing even out. "You're safe." I tucked her back in when she refused to get up and have something to eat. She was so tired, she said, insisting that she just needed some rest. So I quietly shooed Max out of the room and closed the door behind us just as the phone rang. I mentally prepared myself to get an earful from Barb about how Mom hadn't shown up for her breakfast shift this morning at the diner. Barb was understanding, but only to a point. She still had a business to run, she'd tell me, and if Mom was going to keep no-showing, she was going to have to replace her. I moved into the living room where Max playfully bounced around, excited at the ringing coming from underneath a pile of papers on the coffee table. No, not papers. Bills. All of them long overdue. I sank to the couch, dug out the cell phone, took a deep breath and answered, certain I could find a way to buy us some more time before Barb cut Mom loose. "Hey, Barb, I'm so sorry, but Mom..." "Hello? Is this Alison Letchworth?" Letchworth was my mom's maiden name, but still. "This is her daughter, Emma. I'm sorry she can't come to the phone right now. Can I take a message?" "My name is Valerie, and I'm calling regarding her grandfather, Hugh. Your great-grandfather, I suppose." I'd never met Hugh, and I'd only found out about him when I had to do a genealogy project for school. Even then, it hadn't been much. We didn't really speak to that side of the family back then, and Mom was the only one left living now. And either way, this woman was going to be out of luck because... "I'm sorry, Hugh passed away years ago," I said, "so I'm not sure how she could help." "I'm afraid that's incorrect. And I'm sorry to tell you this, but Hugh died last week. He's left your mother a rather sizable inheritance. Do you know when she'll be available to speak?" Needless to say, I got Mom out of bed. I sat next to her on the couch as she took the call from Valerie, bleary-eyed and half asleep. As Valerie gave her the details, I watched the fog she'd been existing in start to dissipate. By the time she hung up, she was clear in a way I hadn't seen in months. "Tell me," I'd urged. I could practically see her mind working to process what she'd just been told. "Hugh didn't die of cancer when you were little. Grandma lied to me." My grandma, her mother. "Why would she do that?" Mom shrugged. "I don't know why Grandma did a lot of things. There's a reason you never met her," she said bitterly. "Hugh left us a small sum of money." "I thought the lady said substantial." "He also left us his house, his estate," she'd called it. "Valerie is the estate agent." "That sounds bigger than a normal house," I said. Mom nodded, quite a bit. She looked around our cramped apartment as if seeing it for the first time. My mind raced. If we sold it, we could get out of here. We could pay these bills and move back home. Home, where we'd lived with Dad and Davy as a family. Back to the house we'd had to sell after the accident because there was no way Mom could pay the mortgage on her own. It was still vacant, waiting for a buyer. With the money we'd make from selling an estate, it could be ours again. We could go back to the place where we'd lived with them. I started to well up. Mom. Valerie warned me that the place isn't in the best shape. Hugh was in his 90s. He couldn't keep up with it. Her eyes landed on the pile of past due bills on the coffee table in front of her. I can use the money he left us to pay these off, get out of our lease early. We can move into the estate and, Mom, we can fix it up, get it ready to sell. I'll help. We can do this. Hope blossomed in my chest, just the tiniest spark, but it was there, and I clung to it. The corners of my mom's lips twisted up just the slightest bit. It was the closest I'd seen to a smile in months. I'd take it. A week later, we left that tiny apartment for good and headed for our new temporary home. Hugh lived across the state line on the shores of Lake Desolation, a very popular tourist destination. Mom had handled the drive okay. When we'd hit a pothole, I could see her white-knuckling the wheel in a way she didn't used to before the accident, but her mood stayed even and she'd even sang along to a couple of songs on the radio. It felt almost normal. After 6 hours on the road and a couple of stops for Max to stretch his legs, we pulled onto the road that circled the massive lake. As we drove by, I got a chance to see just how popular this place was. Huge resorts and dozens of cabins dotted the lake shores, and hundreds of tourists were laying out on beaches or driving boats or tubing on the waters. This is it, Mom said, pointing to a small mailbox next to a secluded driveway lined with thick trees. We rumbled down what had to be a mile of asphalt and emerged into a circular drive that brought us right up to Hugh's front door. When I tell you the house is big, I mean huge is an understatement. 3 stories, a carriage house, a separate garage that could hold at least 4 cars, and grounds in the back that must stretch 100 yards to the water. It's sprawling. At first glance, I was actually stunned. Then I took a closer look and saw the weeds poking up through the cracks in the drive, the dust on the windows, the peeling paint and missing shingles. All that wealth, and Hugh had just let it start to rot. Max was excited for our new adventure. He practically jumped out of the open window of the truck the moment we'd stopped and got to work sniffing everything he could get his nose on. He ran around the side of the house just as a woman emerged from the front door. "Alison, I'm Valerie. We spoke on the phone regarding your grandfather's estate." She carried a clipboard and wore a tailored jacket and skirt. Her professional smile didn't quite reach her eyes as she held out a set of keys. "Welcome home." Mom took the keys, weighing them in her hand as if not quite believing they, or this house, were real. "Why don't I show you the back before we head inside?" Valerie said. "Give you a lay of the very substantial land." We followed her around the side of the estate and onto a lawn that hadn't been cut in months. "That's a private beach," Valerie said, pointing to the sand in the distance. A dock stretched out into the dark blue water, and a sailboat was tied to the post at its end. And the property stretches for 20 acres on either side of those tree lines. I stepped onto the wood slats of the dock and gazed out at the vacationers partying on the lake. I couldn't believe that this was currently my life. When I turned back, I saw that Mom hadn't followed me out. She hadn't gone near the water since the accident. And then she turned to Valerie and dropped a bomb. "You said they found Hugh's body in the water?" "What?" I scrambled off the dock and back onto solid land. Looking mildly uncomfortable, Valerie nodded. "Did he drown?" "I believe so, yes," Valerie answered. "I can't speak to the details, but you must know something," I pushed, continuing to put distance between myself and the water lapping at the beach. "If you're handling this place, I mean, we don't know anything about him." It's all speculation, of course, but rumor was that Hugh wouldn't go near the water, ever. "But somehow he ended up out there?" I asked, pointing to the waves. "And not just that, but he decided to live next to a lake for decades?" Valerie seemed to catch herself, as if she was embarrassed that she'd even speak about these rumors. "All idle gossip. You know how small-town people talk. How about we go inside?" And that was the end of that. We followed her in. There was a foyer with soaring ceilings and dark hardwood floors, a massive living room just off to one side with thick plush rugs and overstuffed leather furniture. Just those 2 rooms alone were bigger than the apartment we'd just left. But the wood was scuffed. The paint was chipped. The wallpaper was peeling. Valerie saw us take notice and said, "As I mentioned on the phone, Hugh was unable to fully deal with the upkeep of this place given his advanced age. It'll need to undergo renovations if you plan to sell." Some windows are cracked and will need to be weather sealed. The kitchen appliances will need updating. It went on and on like that through what had to be dozens of rooms. And then we finally ended up at a set of stairs off the kitchen that led down to the basement. Last but not least, the cellar, Valerie said, and descended. It ran the entire length of the estate. Bare light bulbs dangled from the ceiling on thin chains. The walls seemed carved out of rock, and dozens of pieces of what was most likely furniture were draped in dingy sheets covered with dust and cobwebs. And top to bottom, that's it, Valerie crowed. Mom followed her to the stairs, their chatter growing faint as they headed back up to the kitchen, but I was frozen and my voice was caught in my throat. Something was staring at me from one of the darkest corners of the basement. I grabbed my cell phone with a shaking hand and flipped on the flashlight, swept it over the stone walls once, twice. There. A glassy pair of golden eyes glowed in the darkness. I opened my mouth to scream, and then let out a shaky laugh as adrenaline crashed through my system. It was a teddy bear, stuffed into a pile of Hugh's things and forgotten about for what looked like a century. "Emma?" Mom called from upstairs. I turned to the stairs to go, but couldn't escape the feeling that the small stuffed bear watched me as I pulled the chain on the light bulb and left it in the darkness. That was it. We were done with the walkthrough, and Mom and Valerie stood in the foyer hashing out the boring details. I found myself wandering through one of the estate's many hallways. Halfway down, there was an old yellowed sheet hanging over what looked like a mounted frame. There was nothing on any of the other walls, just this one large piece. Curious, I reached out to lift the sheet when I heard the front door shut and my mom call out for me to help her unload the truck. Valerie must have left. So I let my hand drop and turned away. I got 3 steps before I heard the swoosh of fabric behind me. Slowly, I turned to find that the sheet had fallen from what I now saw was a large oil painting of a beautiful African-American woman in a long white dress. Lace sleeves covered her arms, and the neck was high, old-fashioned, but probably of the time when the painting was done. It would have been a stunning portrait, if not for the slashing cuts in the canvas right across the woman's body. It was like someone attacked it with a butcher knife. I moved back toward the painting, drawn to it, my feet feeling like they were moving of their own accord. There was something about the woman. I couldn't tear my eyes away. I studied her face, feeling like the world was falling away. And she blinked.